Wow, winter flew by in a flash. So here it is, my follow-up to my season preview. There's a link in the top right corner if you want to see that, where I give my thoughts on the anime I watched this season now that they've wrapped up. Did my first impressions hold up? Or was I proven wrong? Before we get into it though, here's your obligatory subscribe reminder. That way you can stay up to date on seasonal content from me. Also, I'm not a completionist channel, so if a show you liked isn't on this list, I didn't forget, I just didn't have time to watch it. But still feel free to comment below and tell me how much you liked whatever show. But hey, good news. You can head on over to my Patreon where I run a poll for supporters to vote on what I watch each season. That way you can make sure I see whatever show you want me to. So let's get on into it. I was pretty surprised by the amount of good anime this season because it seemed like they just kept coming. So many started with a ton of potential and actually capitalized on it that I'm impressed. We got some action, fantasy, and a healthy dose of romance that gave it a good mix. Also, I'm not talking about Freerun, since I don't cover continuing cores. I talked about it last season and my thoughts are still the same. It's amazing. Go check it out. So with that, let's talk about what actually aired this season. Dungeon Meshi is a pretty hard show to talk about because it's very much a subtle experience that doesn't smash you in the face with why this anime is great from the get-go. If I told you Trigger did a dungeon delving food anime, most would probably check it out due to the sheer novelty. But what was the hook, as this series isn't just about that. There's strong character chemistry that motivates the core cast, generating cohesion on their otherwise suicidal mission. It makes for a fun, but also tense, and emotional adventure. The setting itself initially feels like a generic fantasy series, but uses classic tabletop tropes as a springboard to pack personality into the dungeon itself, on top of an unexpected political backdrop and strong world building to create an extremely fleshed out series despite its premise. And in that, it manages to pack fluid action, excellent comedic timing, and that beautiful art that Trigger is known for. Going into it, I expected something along the lines of campfire cooking, which was a decent watch, but got a lot more than that, as I found myself pulled into the story and struggle to save Laos' sister, and the oddly lackadaisical approach to that problem, because death in this dungeon is more of a suggestion than anything else. This is what happens when a creative story meets an equally creative studio with a passion to make it work. You get phenomenal animation and an engaging experience overall. Honestly, a really strong entry this season, and a really great source of inspiration for your next D&D campaign if you want a more naturalistic twist on classic monsters. The fact I'm sticking the Unwanted Undead adventurer in this tier might come as a surprise to some, considering it's a fairly average production for a somewhat generic story, but I found myself enjoying this series for how it approached the whole OP protagonist angle. Yeah, we've seen people become stronger as undead before, but the struggle Rent has as a newly minted undead, transformed against his will, and fueled only by his dream to be a top-tier adventurer hits a bit different. Mixing in a genuine struggle to not succumb to his new monstrous nature, and not saddling him with a party of useless meatbags he's meant to protect while serving as eye candy for the audience makes for a refreshing take on this genre. Ultimately, Rent is a bit older, wiser adventurer who gets a second lease on life while uncovering the mysteries about this world. I do feel this peters out a bit towards the end, but the story we got and the way it handles it had me watching each week. Because while this isn't the flashiest, it's a fairly well-developed anime that gives the impression of a grander world than what we see surrounding our main character. So honestly, just a really well done fantasy series. There should have been zero doubts that a sign of affection would end up here. The first episode of this obliterated my usual gripes about romance anime. The two leads have an interesting dynamic, with a very real barrier of communication between them, but that also doesn't stop them from connecting on a deeper level. Yuki's been sheltered most of her life due to her deafness, but she's putting a foot forward in college and makes bold strides pushing herself to approach the guy she has a crush on. And I'll admit, Itsuomi does come off as a bit overbearing and somewhat creepy at times, but he's also an awkward guy who's had to wear down his own reservations because he travels across the world, visiting remote places where he doesn't actually speak the language. And that's purely because he enjoys that sort of stuff. So that leaves two people who want to push their own boundaries in a relationship that actually goes places. Pardon the pun, because hey, this series doesn't end at a confession. I like how this doesn't wallow in pointless will they won't they or throwing multiple drama traps in the way of their relationship to prevent them from getting together, because there's already a pretty big speed bump there, basic communication. Now I don't think this series uses Yuki's deafness as effectively as it could, but it still utilizes it as an important aspect of this story, without turning it into a pity point. Ajiado can be a hit or miss studio, but they went above and beyond to create an emotional presentation for a story that's incredibly heartwarming. I really enjoyed this entry, if you couldn't tell, because it defied what most romance anime does, so it's definitely worth a watch. It's pretty rare I get to say this, but Solo Leveling was done pretty dirty by its first episode. This would have benefited immensely from having an hour-long premiere. Hell, A1 Pictures didn't even flaunt how hard they were going on the animation, leaving first-time viewers with a pretty average experience. Luckily, that clears up pretty quick within the second episode. This anime hits hard, essentially welcoming you to the real Solo Leveling from that point on. And that's when you realize what all the hype was actually about. Take One Punch Man but remove the gags, and inject a healthy dose of brutal action, and you come away with a pretty good snapshot of this series. Yeah, sometimes distilled hype is great for its own sake, and this production honed in on what works about this series. Incredibly well-animated fights, a struggle for life and death, with a protagonist coming out on the other end of each near-death experience much stronger than before. And in the backdrop of that is a narrative about late-stage capitalism ruining the world and commodifying the lives of those who support it. So the really cool fights and stellar music score hit you on an emotional level, while the story's what actually keeps you tuned in. Speaking of, the subtle approach to how it tells you the nuance of this world shows a great attention to detail while not overloading the audience with information, so it builds upon itself as it goes. For something I didn't really have high expectations for, I was blown away, though fans of the light novels and manhwa already knew what they were in for. Yeah, it's really no surprise the Dangers in My Heart ended up here. Most anime that spends forever in the flirty will they won't they stage gets pretty boring, but this series has about two things that keep that dynamic from getting old. A steady sense of progression, and incremental character growth. Ichikawa and Yamada's relationship is at the point where they're practically dating without outright saying they like each other. And as much as they want to confess, that lingering thought of, maybe I misread this, keeps them from taking that final step. Which is understandable and accurate, especially in these characters' age group, because ultimately, this is a middle school crush where the cast breed that awkward adolescence, where they're not quite children, but still aren't sure how to tackle the world through a grown-up lens. It presents not just a realistic romance, but one that's unique, because the two leads aren't walking cliches. Ichikawa is probably one of the most developed male leads in a romance I've seen in a while, where his personality and thoughts are integral to the way the story actually plays out. And Yamada's golden retriever disposition makes for a good balance for him. The first season was pretty interesting, but the follow-up here really cemented this as a solid romance anime. Definitely worth a look, especially if you're feeling light on those. Seventh Time Loop did an amazing job framing its story while elaborating on it as it developed. The idea of time loops and our main character reliving a 5-year span multiple times and gaining different experiences seems like a gimmick to explain why she's so knowledgeable and capable at first glance. But the fact that characters from her past lives re-enter the story, and she's forced to dance a fine line between knowing too much and playing dumb, creates an interesting dynamic for the story to play against. That being her latest attempt to survive by courting the guy who directly, or sometimes indirectly, caused her death over the past 6 loops. I really liked how this starts, with the foundation of this being this is our main character, these are her lives, but grows into how each of those helped her, while expanding on her personality in the world itself. The people she learned from or interacted with in her past loops don't just cease to exist, they actually come back and play an important part in this story. And this all leads into why the world ended up in the state it does in just a few years, while slowly tackling the main mystery of what is Prince Arnold's ultimate goal. On top of that, Reijou isn't a teenager like she seems, she's essentially middle-aged mentally. And because of this whole time loop thing, she has a lot of different life experience that creates her particular disposition. There's a lot of little answers in this one that satisfy you episode to episode, as a bigger story slowly unfolds for a gripping experience overall, to the point I couldn't wait each week to watch. So it's worth checking out, especially for something that's a bit different in the villainous genre. The weakest Tamer began a journey to pick up trash grabbed me in the first episode, with an optimistic take on a pretty depressing premise. This series could have easily been a pointless fluff sort of isekai, but by stripping the isekai elements down to the bare bones, where the main character feels like an entirely separate entity from her previous life, we're left with a really small-scale fantasy series that focuses heavily on a deeply traumatized character learning to open up and let the world in. The world building here was pretty subtle, where how the magic and such work is slowly elaborated on, and I really enjoyed how magic and skills were incorporated into this setting. These are things that are common daily aspects of life, but powerful magic and skills are rare. Most citizens just have like one thing they're pretty good at, and it's a quirk of their life rather than defining it. And Ivy is missing out on that, which creates a lot of the tension in this series, because she's insecure and scared of how others will view her lack of talent. So yes, this could have been a pointless fluff series, but there's still a wholesome aspect to it that has a purpose, which is honestly some of the best ways to present fluff, because it feels earned. The animation for the first few episodes was something else, but it does peter out as it goes on. Now, it never hits the point where it's outright bad, and the artistic direction is still pretty strong throughout, so it's still a pretty good watch. An otherwise nice debut for a new studio. I really enjoyed this anime because it was a complex take on an otherwise simple premise, and it actually managed to follow through. And with that, we've made it to the middle of the pack. By far our biggest segment this season, but by no means bad. These shows are a decent watch, but had something holding them back from greatness, and as such, come with a conditional recommendation. So let's take a look. The first outing of bottom tier Tomozaki ranked higher than this, but I blame the abysmal season it aired in. The second highlights how little this anime has to offer. Don't get me wrong, it's a decent high school slice of life comedy with bits of romance thrown in, but what it offers beyond that is not much. The main dude's character development is about the only thing keeping people watching, because the core cast just isn't that interesting. They're mostly a collection of one trait, and it just isn't that engaging to see one dude springboard around from one major school event to the next, all while dealing with melodrama between. Yes, Tomozaki is growing and becoming a more well-rounded person, but the rest of the world still feels stagnant around him. And after over 20 episodes, I'm not really seeing much of a change to keep me invested. If you like this specific genre of high school rom-com light novel adaptations, you're probably loving this series. But otherwise, there's an ever-increasing number of these out there that it no longer feels special. Gushing over magical girls is the type of show I loathe to talk about. The end product was fine for an anime. It had some decent humor, and the animation fell off at the halfway point, as to be expected. However, it was an incredibly horny series that only had some mildly entertaining ideas, but mostly relied on sexualizing young girls to sell itself. Is the manga this bad? Yeah, but this buried the lead that these are middle school girls by never addressing it. Anyway, ignoring my absolute desensitized stupor to that, what did we end up getting here? In retrospect, not much, besides extreme ecchi with some borderline pornographic scenes. The characters aren't deep or nuanced, and mostly just serve as a vehicle for jokes or to ogle. As for those jokes, it plays off subverting expectations and throwing curveballs at the audience for a cheap laugh. While the first episode gave the impression this was satirizing a specific twist on the magical girl genre, one you can't really talk about on YouTube, that turned out not to be true, because as it went on, it turned into a barely passable 4TV version of said genre. So you're probably asking then, why is it up here? It sounds like I didn't really enjoy it. Well, what story there is somewhat engaging, as it's about a girl recruited into an evil organization to fight magical girls, but she's a magical girl stan, and eventually works her way up to the head of said organization so she can basically play fight them and prop them up while sating her own depraved desires. That on its own is interesting enough, and as a civil war breaks out in the organization, it does become pretty fun. I mean, if you're really desensitized to ecchi and, I don't know, could look past the age of these girls, it might be worth a look. The wrong way to use healing magic wasn't the most original isekai, but it certainly understood the assignment. The series isn't focused on the main character dominating the world with his overwhelming power or rushing to the point he becomes OP. It's actually about people being transported and having to adapt to their new world, while also coping with their new responsibilities in it. It's a very proactive and realistic approach to the isekai genre, where the characters are heroes, but actively have to take up that role for the sake of the people, not just because they're expected to by the narrative. And I like how much effort went into establishing these characters and world. Even if it made the pace a bit slower, it ultimately makes them much more identifiable and relatable to the audience, probably because they're characters and not just a collection of cliches. But what's holding it back from greatness is just the fact that while it does isekai incredibly well, it's still in a fairly generic kingdom with magic and fighting a demon lord. Yeah, while it doesn't wallow in the more offensive tropes, it also doesn't do much to break out of or define itself in the genre, and in that aspect, there are better isekai to watch than this. So I guess check it out if you're looking for a bit slower paced isekai. This might upset some people, but Mr. Villain's Day Off was just very okay. Yeah, it's a fun sort of slice of life comedy about a Sentai villain just enjoying his days off on Earth when he's not trying to destroy humanity, and that works, but we've also seen plenty of anime do the exact same premise. This one really didn't have much to offer outside its simplicity. Unlike the others that work in aspects of Japanese work culture, black companies, or office romances, this one stripped down to the basics of just the bad guy loving some pandas. And that's okay, but it just doesn't have much staying power. Outside the thirst women have for that curly head of hair, that is. And again, that's not a bad thing. If you're looking for a relaxing sort of show without much in terms of consequences, this is a pretty decent way to kill an afternoon, by following a man on his quest for cute pandas, and to get some limited time snacks. Hokkaido Gals Are Super Adorable was another weirdly horny series, but rather than being overtly fanservice-y, it focused on some oddly fetishistic stuff, sneezing, sweaty girls, and other random stuff that give the impression that yes, this is indeed the author's fetish. Mostly just coming across as weird because these are portrayed as cute or moe type situations. Anyway, where this ends up is a more middle of the road entry that doesn't really stand out, despite the juxtaposition of country girl, snow, and gyaru. It can be cute and endearing, which gives it points, because yes, the core cast are sort of adorkable nerds, extremely positive and fun. But what's getting you through this series besides that? The jokes aren't particularly good, mostly moving at a slow pace and poking fun at the guy for feeling super lucky. And the oddly conservative grandma is a massive buzzkill that drains all the fun out of the scene she's involved in. So cute is apparently what I'm watching for, and that doesn't really carry an entire 12-episode full-length show. If you're really desperate for some cute girls doing a thing anime, I guess this could fill that itch seasonally, but it won't leave much of an impression beyond that. I thoroughly enjoyed Villainess Level 99 because this anime knew exactly what it was. Did an excellent job pulling it off. A fairly simplistic villainous isekai where the lead maxes out her stats due to severe gamer brain rot, announced herself as the secret boss pretty early on, and in the process of min-maxing herself to oblivion, she keeps drawing more and more attention to herself, and subsequently fear. Yumiela's particular brand of uninterested naivete and deep understanding of the game's story made for a lot of great moments, where she's talking like this is a game to people who are very much of the mindset that this is reality. So there's some solid comedy throughout. For animation, it's not really flashy, but the studio knew the direction for this show was more gag-focused. Instead of going for crazy sakuga or style, it focused more on timing and pulling off a janky but charming look that reinforces the punchlines. Going by this, it sounds like I really enjoyed this anime, and while it was a good watch, the issue comes in that this doesn't really do much to differentiate itself from other villainous isekai. Hell, 7th Time Loop was an all-around better series, minus the isekai aspect, so there is a reason why this didn't place higher in my list. If it had been another season, this probably would have done better, because unfortunately, we've seen this before. Even if this is a decent example in the genre, if you're dying for some villainous or comedy, this is an easy pickup. You know, Cherry Magic was an infectious watch, but hits a wall pretty early on, animation-wise. Goddamn, boys love cannot catch a break. And for a series with a somewhat problematic premise of a guy suddenly gaining the power to read minds because he was a virgin until he was 30, it dodged that bullet throughout, by the guy using his power to fix problems and make people happier. This was a pretty solid season for romance, where progress was made. Because hey, we have another entry where the characters actually made a move about halfway through. Said relationship was a definite highlight too. Our awkward protagonist debating whether he should accept his coworkers' feelings as they spend more time together, building a friendship, and ultimately taking the plunge after realizing he does have feelings for the guy, made for a nice arc early on. And his love interest's perfect facade being the product of immense pressure he puts on himself, while loving the dude because he recognizes his hard work, makes for a solid starting line in this series. Now I do feel the anime falls into a lot of cliches most other romance stories do, where things go great at first, but there's always something interrupting genuine moments to avoid wrapping it up too early. And there's the obligatory tedious drama that always crops up, and that's ultimately why it's down here. On paper, this is great, but the execution is a bit standard. If you're looking for some boys love this season, this is worth a look, but I wouldn't go in expecting anything groundbreaking. I'm really surprised how lukewarm I was on Metallic Rouge. This series had a stellar opening episode, and even after that, the first few gave the impression that this was going to be fairly large in scope. That's usually a pretty good indication for original anime, because either the first episode crams in too many ideas and doesn't really tell you what the story's going to be about, or it knocks it out of the park and just keeps hitting. This was a rare case where it actually fell apart about halfway through. Surprise, surprise, there were too many ideas up in the air, too many themes they tried to tackle, and fell for the usual original anime trap of firmly shoving their own head up their ass by getting too existential for no reason. You know what a corporate murder mystery plot with badass robot fights needs? Questioning if the main character has free will, her purpose, if robots deserve equal rights, and hell, throw in an interstellar war on top of that. All while ballooning the cast and killing them off about as quick as they're introduced to the point that I'm not even really sure what matters anymore. This would have done much better if the script had honed in on what it wanted to tell. And I'm sure that comes across as though I hated this anime, but I actually didn't. It just makes it a tad confusing and tedious to watch. Now the end product is a story you can follow, but it does feel pretentious, with some really interesting visuals and likable leads. Bones did a really great job animating this series, and I think it's a decent story that has some interesting ideas, but it just failed to bring them together in a cohesive way. The Witch and the Beast was a pretty unfortunate entry. I'm less displeased with the series itself, and more the runtime on it. If this was being made in the mid-2000s, it would have gotten 2 cores no problem, and felt like a much more complete series. Instead, we're left with a pretty interesting world, a magic system that feels complex, but doesn't really get explained because they didn't have time, mysteries about our core cast that won't get answered, and a string of incredibly cool moments that are built up for a story that most likely won't get a conclusion in anime form. The dynamic between the 2 leads is fun, the mixture of mystery and edgy magic battle formula doesn't really get stale, but I'm stuck wondering where any of this is going. The fact this takes a break from our 2 leads to focus on 2 different characters who could have been the protagonists of their own series was a bold choice, I guess, especially in a 12-episode anime, but ultimately a poor decision. The pacing here was a nightmare. The animation was a bit hard to place here because I think the artwork stands up on its own, but the animation itself isn't really the best. I mean, it's also not the worst, but the striking gothic color palette did a lot of the heavy lifting visually, so where does that leave this? An entry that had the potential to be a pretty interesting fantasy series, unlike many others on the market, but unfocused on what arcs it should actually adapt, making it a lot less impactful than it should have been. With that, we're moving on to the shows I would classify as bad. That doesn't mean they're not worth looking at, but they have more than one thing holding them back, and I'm struggling to find an audience to recommend it to. Either animation, plot, pacing, or characters. So let's get on into it. It really shouldn't be a surprise that Chain Soldier ranked so low. This felt like an even less enjoyable gushing over magical girls. This was another unabashedly horny anime that leaned hard into fetishism without having a purpose. The slave and S&M themes here are literally just a gimmick to get viewers to watch, because the core story has nothing of actual value to offer. It's a fairly bog-standard Japan is attacked by another dimension full of generic monsters anime, and for some reason, high school girls are the only ones who can actually fight back. That is until our main dude thought too hard with his dick, and ended up as a slave to one girl so now he can fight too, for some reason. And the thing is, it doesn't seem to care much about that plot, because it focuses on random slice of life stuff for multiple episodes, and has the balls to pull off, with a straight face, one of the most cliched twists it possibly could have had. I feel like I've seen this show before. I couldn't really tell you where, but there's so little originality in this series, it's just the impression I get. The characters are bland with the bare bones for motivation, the power system had some potential, that is until you realize it's a mixture of devil fruits from One Piece and stands from JoJo's. And to top it all off, the art is just plain ugly, because poor CG and brown and purples don't really make for a visually engaging experience. Yeah, I said that in my season preview, it holds true. There are plenty of shows out there that do what this one does, but better, so check those out instead. My instant death ability is so overpowered was literally the epitome of junk food isekai. And here's the thing, this series was absolute garbage, but I enjoyed it as a casual way to turn off my brain. It's a nonsensical amalgamation of ideas cobbled together for the sake of cheap laughs. There's barely a plot, it comes across as whatever random idea took the author's fancy at that moment was written into the story, and then abandoned about as quickly. However, because there's so little regard shown, it means there's zero consequences or stakes to get invested in, and the show becomes more of an extended improv session packed with anime tropes and anticlimaxes. The amount of literal deities this dude kills off with a thought is actually funny. Animation for this was abysmally bad and practically zero effort was put in. And no, that doesn't just mean the action scenes, because those are also non-existent. Even comedy can pack visual style, energy, and look nice. This doesn't do that. The production here was about as low effort as the script. So I guess you're wondering, why is it down here? Kinda sounds like I might have a soft spot for this series. Not really. Because despite it being full of gags and maybe getting a laugh, it doesn't really amount to much besides that barely coherent string of gags. There's other OP isekai protagonist anime to watch, and I don't really see a reason for anyone to seek this out over anything else. Vanished from the Hero Party's second season was a far cry from the first, mostly because it feels like the main story's wrapped up, and it just keeps overextending itself. The hook for a new hero who's a different kind of messed up compared to Rudy did have some potential, but the fact that thread doesn't really gain any traction until halfway through the season doesn't really do it any favors. Rit and Red's relationship was still a highlight, but also falls off since they're still in that hyper flirty stage despite them essentially being married now. Kinda wanna see their relationship mature a little bit, and that doesn't happen. So this really just strikes me as a case where the story doesn't really know how to continue, but it sold well enough, so it might as well get another season. And that's a damn shame. I'm not gonna lie, I really wanted to drop the foolish angel dances with the devil after the first episode, because of just how much it failed to live up to its description. The humor is childish, feeling reminiscent of Kokoro-chan, but what worked in a 20-year-old edgy comedy OVA doesn't in a fairly tame modern TV anime. However, I did manage to stick it out a bit longer, before ultimately deciding this wasn't worth my time. The premise of an angel and devil doing a Kaguya love is war sounds great on paper, but the execution here was off. Because it's full of childish humor, a forced romance where the two try to seduce one another, despite her having him on a very literal leash, and the animation flexed for about half a scene in the first episode and didn't try since. So the final product also looks like something trapped in the mid-2000s. I'm disappointed because there was potential here, but my issues with this series are less with the anime and more with the squandered source material. At the end of the day, it's a middling production, but nothing the studio really could have done besides a complete rewrite of the series. That wouldn't have gone over with the single existing fan. If you're looking for a combative crush sort of anime, go rewatch Kaguya, because this has very little redeeming value. So that's it. We've wrapped up the winter 2024 anime season, and I was surprised just how many shows were actually worth a watch. Plenty of action, a surprising amount of romance, and hell, even isekai had decent showings. But tell me your thoughts down below. Which anime did you enjoy this season? I'd love to hear it. For now though, hey, you've made it to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and do all the other YouTube stuff to help the channel grow. You can also join my Discord with the link down in the description. And if you really want to support me, you can head on over to my Patreon and pick up some extra perks. Hey, spring anime is around the corner. That means by tossing me $1, you could vote on what I watch next season. Speaking of Patreon, I'd like to give a special thanks to Ariel Summer Sage Stott, JMonth33A, Pokeflute, Robin DBL, Samuel Chen, Tristan, and Vonstrom for their continued support. Thanks for watching.